back to Bumblebee viewer for today's video, the top 10 messed up things done by kings in England. Messy king number 10 is Henry IV, a truly awful ruler. I'd include England's catastrophic defeats to Joan of Arc as his fault, but let's be for real. Henry had no control over that. He was easily influenced, his opinion changed with whoever he spoke to, and he often fell prey to the interests of factions at court. Because that's what you need from a king during a time when multiple people have strong claim to the English throne, your court is incredibly polarized, and everyone hates everyone. Uncertainty made Henry indecisive, and consequently, whenever his nobles were squabbling, so always, he'd simply bury his head in the sand and try to appease everybody. Had Henry properly reigned in Richard of York, history might have gone very differently. Don't forget all of his attempts at reconciliation were useless and did absolutely nothing but give the Yorkists time to plot and recuperate. And speaking of war, he was the total idiot who just goes surrendering Normandy without a serious fight and then rewarded the man who did it. Call me stupid, but I don't think that's very good policy against France. Lightning round at this point, he was mentally unstable, he ruled via favoritism and nepotism, and the jackass managed to get captured 3 times. 3! And icing on the cake, his reign ultimately caused the War of Roses, which basically destroyed England and led to nearly a century of English weakness. Messy king number 9 is George IV. George started out as a handsome, witty, and culturally refined prince who was well regarded by the public, even to the extent that he was bestowed the nickname the First Gentleman of England. However, the First Gentleman was anything but to his wife Caroline of Brunswick. See, George really wanted to be with this girl named Maria and secretly married her in 1785. However, members of the royal family under the age of 25 were forbidden to marry without the king's consent, and the king needed George to repay his parliamentary debt, which he had a lot of because he was a big spender. The prince was contracted into a loveless marriage with Caroline, so George decided to paint Caroline as the villain of his life, the physicalization of everything he was being denied, and he took his anger out on her for it. Caroline, meanwhile, was short, stocky, and well, unfortunately, she didn't ever change her underwear. She was one of those, so she didn't smell too great. George hated her so much he got blackout drunk on their wedding night and collapsed into the bedroom grate and remained there until dawn. He sent her away via a note and even offered her £50,000 to stay out of the country after he'd been crowned king. So the House of Lords set a mission to obtain a divorce for the king. Caroline, I may mention, was ahead of her times as a woman. As in, she went outside nude a lot and made public displays of adult acts and was overall morally offensive in their time, so the evidence against her for a divorce was plentiful. But 52 days of court and the case is dropped. George's coronation was to be on the 29th of April 1821. Caroline asked the prime minister what to wear and was told that she would not be taking part in it. Didn't stop her from showing up and demanding admittance, but the officials had the door slammed in her face. She proceeded to send George a note that night asking for her coronation to be next Monday. She died 19 days after her frustrated attempt to get into the abbey, and George went on happily. Messy king number 8 is Henry VIII. Where do I begin? How do I begin? As everyone on earth at this point knows, Henry VIII is the divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived guy who gave his kingdom 6 queens before he could crap out a single heir. He famously created a whole new religion just to get in Anne Boleyn's girdle, forever the world's biggest proof that the P word is power. And he created the groom of the stool and had a laundry list of shitty mannerisms that would take multiple of these videos to cover. Trust me, just search Henry VIII on the Bumblebee channel and you'll see we have an endless slew of videos covering him, and there's still always something new. So I recommend you subscribe to the Hive if you want to stay up to date on all of your Tudor drama and more. It's pretty obvious picking one messy thing about Henry is hard, so I landed on the whole kissing the bed thing. That's right, just like how mommy made your bed as a wee baby, Henry had his made by a group of grown-ass men who were then obligated to kiss his bed sheets. This wasn't some keep the monsters away tactic either, unless we count Aqua Tofana, Ratsbane, Monk's Blood, or Nightshade as monsters, as they're all poisons used to take a life. Henry was riddled with paranoia about someone slipping poison in his food, but in his later years it became his beverages, his clothes, his wash bucket, his butt wipe stick, his bed sheets. He was even more afraid for his son Edward and never let him wear new garments bought straight from the tailor. So his solution, make everyone touch stuff stuff with their mouth and lips before he did. Messy King number 7 is Aethelred. Bet you haven't heard of this guy, and it's not just because my dyslexic ass is definitely saying that name wrong. He is an Anglo-Saxon king who effed up all of England. In fact, his weak leadership ultimately led to England being subjected to nearly 40 years of Viking rule. So, to start, Aethelred managed to lose a third of his fleet to a petty dispute, right before the Vikings turned up. When they did, he didn't know how to handle them at all. So in 991, after getting his ass kicked enough, Aethelred, desperate, has a dumbass idea and pays the Vikings 10,000 pounds of silver to get him to F off. He literally gave them 10,000 pounds of silver after they'd won a battle against him. The second he did that, the Vikings were like, well shit, I didn't know you had money like that, and proceeded to go even harder at the kingdom, knowing the incompetent king would just buy them off at this point. England became a piñata to the Vikings. They just beat it and the goodies would all fall out. The Dane king Sven Forkbeard managed to force the king into paying 36,000 pounds of silver in total, a ruinously expensive sum for the country of England. But of course, nothing was more messed up than the St. Brice Days mass killing. I don't need to explain to you how that would be bad, especially given that this is a widely believed to have caused his overthrow. He had been told that the Danes in England would faithlessly take his life and then all of his counselors and then possess his kingdom. So Aethelred decided to kill every single Danish person in England. Years of Viking raids and the resultant economic hardships of his coughing up cash left some areas of the Anglo-Saxon England with a score to settle against the Danes. So the exact number of Danes' deaths on the day of the onslaught is actually unknown, but said to be in the high thousands. One victim was Gunhildi, the sister of the Danish king Forkbeard. Naturally, Forkbeard decided to turn it up a notch, even higher in retaliation. Instead of just lightning raiders that appeared and disappeared, Sven now mounted continual attacks lasting over a decade. By 1013, Aethelred and his wife Emma of Normandy and their sons had been forced into exile. Messy King number 6 is Edward VIII, aka the Sympathizer, because that's how he felt about Schmittler's regime. Edward spent his youth being a flagrant playboy POS, wasting everyone's time and money. Then he met Wallis Simpson, and the two did what any two people would do when a woman is twice divorced, currently married, and is a walking scandal for the heir to a kingdom's throne: have a poorly hidden affair. When dear old dad dies, Edward lands the throne and is widely unpopular and just poor at ruling. In the end, after a brief reign, he abdicates to marry the now 3 times divorced Wallis, and the two are immediately exiled. Turns out Wallis had some past affairs with German soldiers, and the government suspected she might be an information leak. Hint, hint, she and Edward definitely were. Do not get it twisted. A long, strong streak of anti-Jewish sentiment runs through the British government and royal family. So what they were concerned about when they chose to exile the couple was their own public image. Edward's strongly pro-German sentiments were shared by the others in the family and parliament, but outspokenness as heir to the throne made his words potentially dangerous to the public and could cause discourse from their people. In 1937, 4 months after their marriage, the couple went to Germany and were met by a massive cheering crowd, many of whom greeted the former king with the Yahtzee salute, which Edward frequently returned. They were feted at receptions, dined with several high-ranking officials, and even visited a training school for future members of the Deadly Guard. This and much more evidence of their allyship with the Yahtzee party was contained in the Marburg papers. Not that it needed to be. They kept signed pictures of the dictator in their house and loved their little Germany trips. Messy King number 5 is the half-brothers, Pedro versus Enrique, a tale as old as time. Both were the sons of Alfonso, King of Castile. However, only Pedro was legitimate, but only Enrique had grown up with dear old dad. They had their reasons to hate one another, but Pedro was the one who crossed the line. He is remembered as the cruel for his violent behaviors that wouldn't escape a diagnosis of sociopathic in modern times. Historian L.J. Andrew Villion described the Castilian king as a suspicious and vindictive personality. He employed deceit and cruelty whenever he encountered the opposition, real or imagined. His unforgiving nature combined with a very long memory made it hazardous for an opponent to attempt reconciliation with the king. Probably why when his twin brother had his head bashed in by Pedro, Enrique didn't try to reconcile. He'd had enough with the bloodshed and the violence, so he rounded up a rebellion and set to work messing things up for Pedro. France and then England get dragged into the mix as allyship form and disintegrate, setting Iberia as a stage for the 100-Year War. By 1369, Pedro was losing big time and forced to retreat to the Montiel castle. He tries to to bribe Bertrand de Gulchen, such as some dude nearby, I guess, no, not much context on who he was, with a ton of cashola and land. Bertrand goes, that's nice. What do you have to offer me, Enrique? And Enrique naturally doubled the offer, so Bertrand lures Pedro out of the castle and to his tent under the guise of an escape plan. Imagine his surprise when he meets Enrique there, and the two have their final bloody blowdown. Enrique wins, and it's the end of Pedro the Cruel of Castile. Messy King number 4 is Charles I. Charles was a man who had an unshakable belief in divine right of kings to rule a country as they saw fit. That's code for I have the God-given right to do whatever the bleep I want, which when you're famously arrogant and stupid is a bit of a problem. This obviously led to his subjects hating him making stupid decisions, and him acting unilaterally and irrationally. And what happens when you mix that cocktail? Stupid wars. Most notable was his war with Spain in 1625, which drained England's already weak finances and was a colossal failure. Oh, and let's not forget his attempts to reform the church in Scotland, which led to a war with Scotland. Also, he managed to get into an expensive, inconsequential war with France, because Buckingham, a noble general dude, funded French rebels without consulting anyone, even the king. But by far, the most well-known bit of his reign was when Charles and the Parliament hated each other. This was mostly due to his arrogance, his friendship with Buckingham, and his recklessness, his stupid spending, and his Catholic wife. I shouldn't need to explain why getting in a fight with Parliament makes you a bad king, and it led to the English Civil War in 1642, which in turn eventually led to Charles's capture, imprisonment, trial, and death. Messy King number 3 is Charles II. Charles I dies, and after 11 years of unpopular rule by Puritan General Oliver Cromwell and briefly by his son Richard, Charles's son, Charles II, was invited to become king. He proved to be much more popular than his stubborn father. Doesn't mean he wasn't weird as all hell though. See, our boy King Charles II drank human skulls. No, you did not mishear me. He drank human skulls, not from human skulls, all Shakespearean drama style. In those days, dead body parts called mumia were often sold to apothecaries and physicians who believed they contained some form of life force left over from the last person. It was an expensive elixir tincture called the King's Drops that Charles drank. The human skulls were from Ireland, ground and mixed into booze. It was thought to be medicinal. Also, this is the king that made the pube wig that people at drinking clubs would kiss, so yeah. Messy King number 2 is Prince Philip, another more modern monarch with the same issue as the last. Flagrantly offensive and oppressive ideology. What was noted at the time as silly gaffes in the British news press were actually some pretty effed up offensive racial statements made by Prince Philip. He once told a British student studying internationally in China that by the time he'd get home, his eyes would change shape. And that's me watering down the statement. He said it a lot worse than that. He also asked an indigenous Australian if they still throw spears at each other. He asked an islander, aren't most of you descended from pirates? And while in the Cayman Islands in 1994, he even told the Nigerian president that you look like you're ready for bed when the guy was dressed in traditional robes in 2003. Guys, I shit you not, I could keep going, because if you Google it, there are whole lists people have made compiling his horribly offensive comments, and I stuck to the PG ones. And don't forget the crap show in 2019 when Andrews openly discussed being besties with a certain someone who had a certain island. Prince Andrew's interview saw him defending that lifestyle of unconsenting intercourse, substance abuse, and violence, with a bizarre claim that he had a tendency to be too honorable, and it was this honor that kept him from breaking off his relations with that certain someone, even after the latter was jailed for their crimes, or, as the prince calls it, conducting himself in a manner unbecoming. The last messy king, number 1, is John I. Even before he came to the throne, he was a total moron. John endlessly rebelled during his brother's reign, and it put a massive strain on the country's finances. You'd think his brother would just kill or exile him, but nobody tried to contain John the jackass. Not a smart move when you consider that these very financial problems he was causing would ruin his war with France a few years into his own reign. He was awful at dealing with nobles. He was extremely rude to them, treated them with utter disdain, and took them for granted, even in times of war when he really needed them. He also killed his own nephew in a time where chivalrous battle meant noblemen wouldn't be killed by enemies on the other side, rather taken hostage and returned when payment is made. Instead, John blinds him and shoves his ass out a window. The other 22 knights taken captive with his nephew are then sent to starve to death, and I can't stress enough how unheard of this was to do in 1210 England, and it blew some plebeian minds, alright. John destroyed the Angevin Empire. Within 5 years of his reign, he lost half his inheritance of France. Also, down the drain goes a century of Plantagenet control over France, followed by the Plantagenet/Norman control of Normandy, which had stood for 150 years before John came along and screwed it up. Need I say more? I will! He got his entire Christian country excommunicated from the church because he was arguing with the Pope over who should control the English church. He did not listen to his barons and noblemen and advisors, but he chose foreign advisors who often double-crossed him. He had an agreement, the Magna Carta, but he abandoned it, causing the barons to fight against him and rally behind Prince Louis to replace John. Doesn't matter though, because he either died of dysentery or having food poisoned because he shit himself to death in under 18 hours. Alright, thank you once again for tuning into Bumblebee. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Be sure to like and subscribe, and maybe drop some comments down below on what you thought of these kings. Bye.